The materials that you'll need for this lesson you can see here on the table. We're going to need metal spatulas, disposable brushes, rasps, and I prefer Stanley rasps, Vaseline, bowls to mix plaster in, and I prefer rubber bowls as they are flexible, which means they're easy to clean and they do last forever. And of course we're going to need burlap and plaster. Before beginning any work, however, I always make sure that my table is set up as you can see here and that I'm prepared for work. Running around and trying to organize while mixing plaster and trying to manage setting times is not a good recipe for success. Anything I can do in advance, I try to do in advance. This includes setting up the table and having all my materials and tools easily available to me, and it also includes prepping any materials that can be prepped. So, for example, I'm going to cut my burlap into small squares that I can use before beginning the plaster work, so I don't have to do that while the plaster is setting up. Once that work begins, I don't want to mess around with cutting burlap, as that will certainly stress me out and make me do a bad job. I want a calm and relaxed working scenario where everything is pre-planned and ideally nothing goes awry. Mixing plaster is very straightforward. Remember that plaster should be mixed the same way every time, no matter what the goal of that plaster bowl is. Mixing like I'm going to show you here is a guaranteed way of always getting a good bowl of plaster to work with. First, have water in your bowl. I would say no more than 1/3 of the bowl should be filled with water. Any more water than this and you can have the plaster overflow the bowl. Then we'll add the plaster powder, slowly sifting it in and not dumping big lumps of it straight into the water. Let the plaster sink into the water before adding more plaster. Once the bowl starts filling up and the plaster reaches the surface of the water, try to start sifting the plaster around the bowl, not just in the middle, making sure that we don't have one big mound in the middle, but an even distribution of plaster throughout the entire bowl. Once you get a little dry island on the surface of the water, a very shallow dry island, not a big peak, then it's time to wait for a minute or two while the water seeps into all the plaster. This will minimize mixing and therefore air bubbles. After a minute or two, the white plaster island is going to turn gray and start cracking. It will look like a dry riverbed, but this is because the plaster has been soaked with water. And when this has happened, you can mix the plaster using your hands or a spatula. Make sure at this point that the plaster mix is even, and if there is any lumps, you want to break those up, so that the plaster mix is of an even consistency when you start using it. The more careful you are with sifting plaster into the bowl, and the more careful or patient you are with letting the bowl sit for a couple of minutes, the less mixing you should require, and you'll get a stronger bowl of plaster for it. Because you will have less air bubbles, of course. It will also give you more working time, as stirring the plaster a lot actually makes it set up faster. The same thing goes for using warm water, so we always use cold water to give ourselves the most working time possible and the best chance, therefore, of doing good work. We don't want to rush. The first thing we'll do is a splash coat. The aim here is to capture details of the silicone and build a bit of thickness before we add the burlap. As you can see, the plaster reacts a little bit like oil on water, or in this scenario, water on oil actually, on the silicone surface. It doesn't really want to stay put. But if you've mixed the bowl of plaster properly, you shouldn't have too many problems with this, as the plaster is going to be sort of thick enough to not separate. If the plaster is really thin, it's going to want to separate a lot. Any areas that do separate, let them sit for a minute or two and then go over the same place a second time, and this should solve the issue. First, I like to brush the plaster on like you imagine brushing something on with a brush would go, but then I like to load up my brush with plaster on the corner of the brush and then use the corner to sort of dab the plaster onto the surface. This keeps the already applied plaster in place while adding a bit of thickness. You don't need this layer to be very thick, frankly, but a few millimeters is probably a good thickness to aim for. Not being able to see the silicone through the plaster is a good measuring stick to see if you've built up enough thickness. At the same time, don't add so much plaster that the thing gets super heavy either. Less is more when it comes to making plaster mother molds, as a heavy mold does not mean a strong mold. Keep the edges clean as well. We'd really like to keep the edges of our silicone skin and the top surface of our silicone skin, our silicone wall, clean. And you'll see why this matters a little bit later in the video. Keeping these top edges of the silicone wall clean gives us something to register the top of our eventual plaster wall to, and makes sure that we know where every part of our mold is during this process. Losing track of this can be troublesome and sometimes lead to issues with the burlap coming up too far and sticking out of the plaster mother mold. You'll see the benefit of keeping a clean wall later on in the video once I start making the plaster wall. Usually once the splash coat is done, I'll let it set up before beginning the next step, which is making the mold stronger with burlap. A lot of my colleagues will forego this first step and just move straight into the burlap without waiting or without even putting down a splash coat. And while I don't think this is really the absolute best way to make the best mold possible, it is a bit of a time saver, and sometimes time savers are worth it. Instead of waiting around this time, I'm just going to jump straight into the burlap with no hesitation. The splash coat is still going to be wet, and therefore some of the burlap might end up showing through to the inside of the mold. Since the burlap must be pressed down a little into the surface in order to avoid air bubbles, I'm going to accept this for now, since the mold I'm making is sort of a quick and dirty mold. Something we can get a decent cast out of, but not something we want to last for decades, and that we would want to take to the foundry to cast bronze sculptures out of. This is certainly the somewhat quick and easy or quick and dirty way to make a pretty decent mold, but it will be more than enough for this sculpture and for what we're trying to get out of this. The burlap is essentially an open weave fabric that we're going to add to the plaster mother mold to increase its strength while keeping the weight down as much as possible. With burlap covering the entire surface of the mold itself cannot break and crack apart as easily as if it was pure plaster. We'll be able to make a mold that's very strong while at the same time very light, which is good for handling and for transporting. Think of the burlap sort of like rebar in concrete or something like that. To add the burlap, we simply dip the cut up burlap pieces into a bowl of fresh plaster. The plaster will soak into the burlap, which we will then squeeze to remove excess plaster, making sure the weight is kept down as much as possible. Not only the weight, but the mess that we make can be limited by doing this. Super wet burlap is going to drip and splash everywhere and create a bit of a mess for us, which we don't want, of course. The burlap is then going to be added to the surface of the mold and pushed down so it fits tightly onto the surface. Remember that we don't want burlap up on the edges of the silicone, so we try to fold the burlap over if it ends up over the silicone wall. Some people will cut these really tiny pieces of burlap, but I think that just makes everything so slow, as you have to add so many pieces when you don't really need to. So I tend to do a bit of a shortcut here and cut much bigger pieces of burlap, and then I'll fold them over if I need to. Burlap is super easy to fold once it's wet with plaster, and does conform to pretty much any surface pretty easily. Sometimes you do get an aggressive edge because you folded the burlap, but I just make sure that such an edge doesn't occur in the same place multiple times over, and if I don't, then it tends to be fine. Start from one end of the burlap, and as you press it down into the surface, don't let the other end lift up. Sometimes if you're covering a gap or a hole or something like that, you can end up with some issues if you don't work the burlap pieces from one end to the other. Working from the middle of the burlap piece works well, of course, as long as it doesn't stretch across a gap and then ends up getting lifted off the surface. We really need the burlap to be tight to the surface, with no gaps between it and the splash coat that we just made. A gap is going to become a hollow inside the mother mold, which can then be broken very easily from the inside. Once broken, you'll have a hole which can then cause misregistration as the silicone skin will sort of push into this hole while casting. While it's certainly an unlikely scenario, I do think it's best to avoid anything like this. Anything where something makes your mold work poorly, you would like to avoid, of course. Making sure the burlap is down onto the surface properly is a big one to watch out for here. I do 2 layers of burlap with every new piece overlapping the piece that came before it. This way, we have an interconnected weave of burlap, which should be very strong. Bigger molds might require 3 layers of burlap, but these days I usually only do smaller molds with plaster anyways. Anything big, and I'll use something stronger like aqua resin or some hydro resin or something like that. And for smaller molds like a portrait or a half life-size figure, 2 layers of burlap is going to be more than enough. Any gaps of pure plaster between any piece of burlap is going to be a weak spot where the mold can crack and split. So make sure that the entire surface is well covered with burlap and that every piece connects to another piece by overlapping them. The folding of the burlap creates some awkward ridges in the surface, as you can probably see, and these I will deal with by using the last bit of plaster that's setting up inside my bowl and it's reaching that creamy consistency, to fill in and smooth out some of the transitions between some of these burlap ridges. Especially as the burlap travels up the side of the silicone wall and is folded over, we tend to get this little gap between the wall and the folded over burlap that can capture air later on unless we're careful. I try to make sure that all of these are smoothed out properly and there is no possibility for air to be trapped anywhere while I'm doing the next step, which is going to be building a plaster wall. When I do build the plaster wall, I want to be able to focus on that and not have to worry about filling gaps, so to avoid trapping air.